Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott. I've been coming at you with HTML5 and CSS3 courtesy of Xerox HTML5 and CSS3 3rd edition. We are in Chapter 5 right now, talking about how to use the CSS box model for spacing and for backgrounds. And I think I probably showed you this earlier, but in case I did not, every single thing that you do on a web page, everything that you create on a web page, all right, it's inside of a box. And that box, as you can see here, has content. In this case, it's a background image. All right. It has padding. It has border. And it has margin. So to see all those in effect, so here's the margin on the outside of the whole thing. There's the background color. There's the actual image. There's the padding. All right. And there's the border. So when we start to move this, you can start to see, hopefully, how this stuff comes together. All right, so kind of keep that in mind as we get started here. Here are our objectives. Given an HTML model, create CSS rule sets that use the CSS box model to apply the correct or desired spacing, borders, and backgrounds to the web page. Describe the use of the CSS box model. Explain how the CSS box model can be used to control the spacing between headings and paragraphs on a page. Describe the effect of collapsed margins. Describe the use of a reset selector. Describe the following properties for a block element in the box model: height, width, margin, padding, border, background, color, and background. Background color and background image. Describe these CSS3 features for formatting boxes: rounded corners, shadows, and background gradients. As always, when you work with this stuff, I cannot say this to you too many times, all right, that as you start working with this stuff, the only way to learn is to practice, practice, practice. All right. So here they're showing the same kind of thing that I showed you before in a 3D type of format. So padding is basically, if you look at this as being the box, padding is the area around your element, and margin is the area around that padding. A lot of times, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, a lot of times what people have the most problem with is when to use padding and when to use border. All right? And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So they give you a formula here on this slide for calculating the height and the width of a box. All right, you can take a look at that at your leisure. The CSS box model lets you work with boxes that a browser places around each block element as well as some inline elements. This lets you add formatting such as margin, padding, and borders. By default, the box for a block element is as wide as the block that contains it, and as tall as it needs to be based on its element. You can use the height and width properties to specify the size of the content area for a block element explicitly. You can use other properties to control margins, padding, and borders for a block element. So we basically jump right into a web page here. This figure presents the HTML for a simple web page. Then the CSS adds borders to the 4 types of elements in the HTML. A dotted 3-pixel border to the body, a solid 2-pixel border to the main element, and a dashed 1-pixel border to the H1 and paragraph elements. If you look at the web page in the browser, you can see how these 4 borders are rendered. You can also see how the margins and padding for these work. So let's take a look at it in the browser. So as I've done many a time, I will create another folder in here. I mean, in some of these you can see, and sometimes I've created folders. So what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, now 14 of the chapters I've created folders, and about 5 of them rather I did not. But as I've told you before, it makes a lot of sense to sit there and play around with this stuff. I don't believe there's, I know personally, I don't think there's any way I'd learn it if I didn't practice it. And I know people will say to me, well, but I don't have time to do that. Well, again, the idea is you're in this class, you're in this program because you'd like to get a career in this. So I could be a wise aleck and say, make the time, but the people who are going to be successful are going to somehow make the time. So this is the town hall then for chapter 5. Alright, we should really change all these too. This should be, well, they should be chapter. So for chapter 5, again, this is the town hall, and we've got 3 different index files. Let's look at the first one. I believe that they're doing these in order. Nope, that sure isn't it. That isn't it. Well, this is interesting. Maybe they just don't have that example in there, even though they tell you to go look at it in the browser. Okay, so none of those are showing. So let's make our own. All right, so I'm going to jump back into here. And we'll paste this in. In fact, let's put in okay, I've temporarily lost control. There it is back. I was going to say I lost control of the mouse. There will be some CSS in here. I think that's everything other than pasting this in. Okay, so we already have the body tag, so I'll get rid of this one. Okay, and get rid of this. Not much in there, as you can see. Let's save that. This is out of Town Hall. Why don't we call this one index 0. 0.html. Alright, and I've got this styles here, which again, I'm going to copy right out of the text. So the idea is it should look like that when we're all done, hopefully. Again, I'm not worried about formatting this or anything else, so styles.css. Run Chrome. You don't run the CSS file though. There it is. So as the author mentions on page 170, all right, there's borders added here to the 4 types of elements. There is a dotted 3-pixel border around the entire body, which you see right here. There is a solid 2-pixel border around the main element, which you see here. And there are dash 1-pixel borders around both the H1 tag, which you see right here, and the paragraph element that you see right here. Now it says in the book, this should help you understand how the box model works. No, you understand how the box model works by playing with a box model. That's all I can tell you. So we've got some properties on pages 172 and 173 that you use for setting widths and heights. The width specifies the width of the content area for a block element. The height specifies the height of a content area for a block element. The minimum width specifies the minimum width for a content area of a block element. Max width, the maximum width for a content area of the block element. Minimum height, the minimum height for a content area of a block element, and max height for the maximum height of the content area of a block element. If you specify a percent for the width property, the width of the content area for the block element is based on the width of the block that contains it, also known as its containing block. In this case, the width of the containing block must be specified explicitly. If you specify a percent for the height property, the height of the content area for the block element is based on the height of the containing block. In that case, the height of the containing block must be explicitly specified, otherwise auto is substituted for your percent. The min width, max width, min height, and max height are typically used to accommodate changes in font size. So let's talk about margins. You've got margin top, which defines the space between the top border of an element and the top of the containing block or the bottom element below it. Margin right, which defines the space between the right border of the element and the right side of the containing block or the left side of the element to its right. Margin bottom, which specifies the space or defines the space between the bottom border of the element and the bottom of the containing block or the top of the element below it. Margin left, the space between the left border of an element and the left side of the containing block, and margin, which allows you to set all of them. If you imagine margins being like a clock, all right, so if this was a clock right here, 12 o'clock would be top, 3 o'clock would be right, 6 o'clock would be bottom, and 9 o'clock would be left. All right. So if you specify the bottom margin for one element and the top margin for the element that follows in the HTML, typically the margins become collapsed, which means only the larger margin is applied. You typically use the auto keyword to center an element in its containing block. To do that, you must also specify the width of the element. As different browsers have different default margins for block elements, you often need to set these margins explicitly. Remember, not only are there margins, but there's padding. So padding top defines the space between the top of an element and its top border. Padding right defines the space between the right side of the element and its right border. Padding bottom defines the space between the bottom of an element and its bottom border. Padding left defines the space between the left side of an element and its left border. And again, you can have padding where you can put all of them. All right, and the same kind of clock thing with 12, 3, 6, and 9. If you set the top and bottom margins for elements to 0, you can use padding to set the spacing between elements. That's if you set the margins to 0. Alright, so here next is a web page that plays with widths and margins and padding. Hopefully you can see this, but the page is centered in the browser window, and it uses margins and paddings to improve the spacing before and after the headings, between the list items, and between paragraphs. The HTML for this page is shown on, it's not shown. CSS for the page is shown on page 181. And on those slides there. Next, we see a slightly modified version of the page that uses a reset selector. I've already talked about the reset selector in the guise of using Eric Meyer stuff. Again, this refers to the use of a universal selector that set margins and padding for all elements to 0. Okay? You saw some of the differences before when I included first the reset file, and then I did the CSS file after it. Okay. Borders and backgrounds. Border allows you to set border width, border style, and border color. Border side allows you to set the width, style, or color for a specific side of a border. Border width allows you to use relative or absolute values or keywords such as thin, thick, and medium. Border style has possibilities like dotted, dashed, solid, double, grooved, ridge, inset, outset, and none, which is the default. Border color can basically be any color you want the border to be. Border side width specifies the width of the indicated side of a border. Border side style, the style for the indicated side of the border. And border side color, the color of the indicated side of the border. And there are some examples that follow. Again, you don't learn by having me say this stuff to you. You learn by playing with this, practicing this. Literally just coming in there and trying some stuff. Alright? So starting on 186 and 187, they talk about how to use CSS3 to add rounded corners and shadows to borders. When you code the border radius property, you can assign one rounding radius to all 4 corners or a different one to each corner. When you code the box shadow property, probably remember this from earlier, positive values offset the shadow right and down, where negatives offset the shadow left and up. The third value in the box shadow property determines how much of the shadow is blurred, and the fourth value determines how far the blur spreads. The fifth value in the box shadow property specifies the color of the shadow. If this is omitted, the color is the same color as the border. These properties are supported by all modern browsers. And if for some reason, if you use them on another kind of browser and they're not supported, they're ignored. All right. I have to literally pause for about 2 minutes here. All right. So the next thing that's discussed in the book here is how to set background colors in images. The properties for setting background color and image are shown here. Background, which allows you to set everything below it, in other words, color, image, repeat, attachment, and position. Color, to specify the color of the element's background. Image, if you want an image for the background. Repeat. The possible values are X repeat, Y repeat, and no repeat, and repeat. Okay? And it's, if you're on the X-axis, basically, you know that it's going to be a vertical repeat. If you're on the Y-axis, it's going to be a horizontal repeat. If you use repeat, it puts the pattern in there as many times as it can. And if you use none, it only puts it in there once. Background attachment specifies whether an image scrolls with a document or remains fixed. And background position specifies the initial horizontal and vertical positions of an image. Don't use a background color or image that makes the text over it difficult to read. In fact, most of the time when you see this stuff and you read about it, hear about it, etc., most of the time, again, what you hear about is that you should not put a background image on a web page, because literally it seems to wash out whatever else is in there. Okay. All right, next the discussion goes to gradients. And gradients are something basically when you have one color fade to another. The CSS for linear gradients lets you create gradients for backgrounds without using images. Today, virtually all of the modern browsers support linear gradients. The first parameter that you see there indicates the direction the gradient will go. To right, for left to right, to bottom, for top to bottom, to left, etc. The direction is followed by two more parameters. They consist of a color and a percent. The first percent indicates where the first color should start, and the last percent indicates where the last color should end. And the percents in between indicate the points at which one gradient stops and the next one begins. There's an example of a gradient. Now the next example, which is on 192 in the book, right here, presents a web page that's similar to one we looked at earlier. In fact, the HTML is identical, but the page in this figure has additional formatting. First, as you can see, the page uses a gradient for the background. Behind the body. It also uses white as the background color for the body. That way the gradient doesn't show behind the body content. Secondly, the page has a border around the body and rounded corners and shadows. Also, the header has a border below it. And the footer has a border above it. Finally, the shadow for the text in the H1 element has been adjusted so that the shadow is black and there is no blur. This makes the heading easier to read. So again, the HTML is the same. The styles for the web page include a border around the page content, a border below the header, and a border above the footer. The border around the body has rounded corners, as you can see, and a drop shadow. The background behind the body, again, is a linear gradient, and if you use a browser that doesn't support linear gradients, it's just ignored then. The associated CSS is shown on page 195 in the book, and on several pages in here. All right, and that pretty much is it. So now you should have at least an understanding of how the box model is used for margins, padding, borders, backgrounds, and background images. But as mentioned previously, the way that you're going to really learn how all this works is to just keep playing with it. All right? Practice. Nothing makes perfect in here, but practice helps you get better. How's that?